Hello, Educate US listeners. Today, I am really honored to have Dr. Keith Dorsey with us. Not only is he an amazing researcher, author, board advisor, corporate director, he's also dedicated to helping leaders and organizations optimize board governance and leadership effectiveness. He's also a friend. So it's great to have you here, Keith.
Great to be here, Stacey. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me just tell you a little more about Keith before we jump in. Uh, He's the founder of the Boardroom Journey that equips executives and aspiring directors with his knowledge and strategies that are needed to break barriers and secure independent director roles. He's a National Association Corporate Director Certified Director and a 2023 NACD Directorship 100 honoree. Dr. Dorsey combines extensive board experience, a doctorate in organizational change and leadership, and deep research on achieving optimal diversity in corporate boards. His insights on governance, leadership, and executive career transitions have been featured in Harvard Business Review, MIT Sloan Management Review, Forbes, Fast Company, Directors, and Boards. And of course, he also has his coming book, which we're so excited about, The Boardroom Journey, Practical Guidance for Women to Secure a Seat at the Table. All right. Oh, Keith, so many amazing accomplishments.
I can't complain. It's been fun out there.
Amazing, amazing. So, what can we learn from you that's not in your bio?
Hmm. Something I mentioned in the preface of the upcoming book and how I got to this point has been the serendipitous journey. Actually, when I decided to go back to school for my doctorate, I wanted to focus on shareholder primacy on corporate boards. I knew I wanted to focus on boards because I already served on boards. I was recently retired from a company that was bought by a private equity firm. And just the way that they were single-mindedly focused on driving growth and shareholder value and in a tactical sort of way, I decided to actually spend time on my doctorate and research shareholder primacy. And I was only within the first month of the doctorate program when I picked that as my problem of practice. And I remember one Saturday afternoon sitting at my desk going through some research paperwork and many different sites. And I found myself researching what was supposed to be the lack of shareholder primacy or shareholder primacy within organizations. And I lift my head up after a few hours and realized I have been researching the lack of gender diversity on corporate boards. Don't ask me how I got down that rabbit hole, but I was there. And after about 4 hours, I lifted my head up and said, why were you researching that when you should have been researching shareholder primacy on corporate boards? And I just giggled and said, I think I was procrastinating, but I'm now behind. So on Sunday, I dove right back in and hoping to be able to complete the assignment that I needed for Monday. And unfortunately, after 2 hours, I lifted my head up again and I was researching the lack of gender diversity on corporate boards. And it was at that point that very next day, I went back into USC and said, I want to change my problem of practice from shareholder primacy to corporate board diversity. And that's how all of this really came about in this serendipitous sort of way.
Well, it's so fascinating. What do you think kept drawing you there?
I think it was the fact that boards at the time that I was researching this, when it came to Fortune 500 boards, I think at the time 83% of the board seats were held by white men. And most people didn't complain about that. It was what it was. But women have been trying for a number of years since Sarbanes-Oxley, if not before, to increase the numbers. And you have organizations like 2020 Women on Boards, were created to actually make certain that by the year 2020, 20% of the board seats will be held by women. And then they got to that level and quickly changed their name from 2020 women on boards to 50-50 women on boards with the same formula. And so it I saw that it was something that was important. My research that I started to uncover that day was around Norway. And what Norway was doing, they had a mandate that they require all public corporations to have at least 40% of their board seats held by women. And I said, wow, they took a stance and they actually got to those numbers. What can we do in the US that's a bit different to get different results? And I was fascinated about that wicked problem, if you will.
So you piqued my curiosity. You said Norway got there, and then you were curious about what US could do differently. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering, as you said Norway got there, like what results did that yield them by getting that, 60/40 board percentage?
You know, we learned a lot since then. When Norway initially came up with that program, it had all the right ingredients except one thing. They didn't build in enough time to give the corporations to find the right women to fill those roles. And so one of the things that they uncovered that kind of backfired on Norway initially, people were pushing back that the women that were being appointed to the boards weren't qualified women. And that may not have been the case, but that was an argument that they put out there. And some people said they could have found even better women if they were given enough time to actually incorporate and execute the actual program. So moving forward, when they did come up with that sort of legislation, other countries and other cities came up with, those sort of parameters. They learned to build in a bit more time. But what we also uncovered was intentionality, what you can do when you are intentionally focused on finding the right people. Because the premise prior was I would hire and I will put more women on boards, but there aren't enough qualified women out there. And that was the myth. And that's exactly what it is. It's a myth. There are a tremendous amount of qualified women out there. You just have to connect the dots. One, make certain that the women are vocal enough about what talent they bring to the table, and most importantly, what they would like. And sometimes getting on a corporate board is the best kept secret. People don't talk about it. Secondly, to make certain that the boards themselves are fishing in different ponds because the average uh, board will bring up during a board meeting, we're looking for someone else to serve on our board, and they will look to the left and say, who do you know? And they will look to the right and ask that person, who do they know? And oftentimes they would just bring up people from their inner circles, whether that's their hunting buddies, golfing buddies, executive club buddies, or whatever. And so you end up surrounding yourselves around the board table with people that you typically work with and socialize with. And oftentimes that may not include women and other people of color or whatever the case may be. And so a lot of people thought there was racism or misogynism or whatever that caused these issues, and that's not necessarily the case. There was no malice oftentimes, and with these boards that were made up of mostly men. It just was, who do you know? Who can you recommend? And it was easy to think of those people. With these programs and with a bit of intentionality, we can now teach others where to find qualified people that don't look like them and have different um, or have diversity of thought, which is very important as well.
I heard you say a few things that really stuck out to me. One is, yes, we hear this a lot, right? Diversifying can be challenging if a person doesn't diversify the communities they engage in, right? If they're not looking outside their own buddies, and often that looks like people who look like them. And so it's really important, and setting guidelines then for how you might go and find qualified people sounds very important. But there was also a piece that you mentioned around there was a myth Like
Mhm.
women weren't qualified. So how, I mean, that is really interesting to me, though, on top of, okay, yes, you're looking in your inner circle, but then also what myths might you hold that need to be disrupted?
And
And
it
I,
wasn't so much, Stacey, that women weren't qualified. It just wasn't enough qualified women. So, from a researcher perspective, I started peeling that back. Why were they saying that? Well, the prerequisite, and you begin to think about the people who typically serve on a corporate board, were men that were either active or former CEOs or CFOs. And so, whether they said it outwardly or not, when they said we're seeking another board member, they were seeking another former or active CEO. And when you begin to look at the plight of women moving up the corporate ladder, and those two roles, women didn't occupy many CEO roles or CFO roles. So by looking at it from that lens, there may not have been enough or as many qualified women for the corporate board. Now let's peel that back further. Why did they need to be former or active CEOs or CFOs? Why couldn't they be CHROs with a tremendous talent background and CHROs and CMOs, chief human resource officers or chief marketing officers over the last 10 to 15 years have taken on this more strategic role? Because when you're talking about growing your business and evolving your business and your strategy, you got to think about the markets that you're going after more strategically and the talent that you need to recruit more strategically. Well, CHROs used to be considered personnel managers. It's so much more now. Marketing managers or CMOs or chief marketing officers used to be just considered this go-to-market sort of person to come up with catchy phrases and things like that. Now they are strategists. Why wouldn't you want someone like with those titles and that functional experience on your corporate board? Chief product officers, chief procurement officers, chief technical officers, or chief information officers because of cybersecurity, AI, different things like that. Once boards started to really think about their strategy and think about ways to mitigate their risks, they saw having that generalist of a CEO or that specialist of a CFO only ticked several of the boxes that they really need, the total number of boxes they really needed to tick to have a well-rounded fiduciary board. And when you begin to think about it that way, not only your C suite, but the direct reports of the people that are on the C suite could be incredibly qualified people for the actual corporate board. And when you begin to fish in those ponds, there are a tremendous amount of women who are qualified and ready to serve on corporate boards.
yeah, I mean, you just spoke to sort of organic diversity, right? Of representation across the board in meaningful ways. And I think that's hinging on, right, with I feel like we need to say, we need to name the fact that right now DEI is having a backlash moment, right? Particularly coming from the federal level, a lot of current executive orders coming out saying no, none of these issues, we don't want anything about supporting DEI, right? We don't
Yes.
want that. We want to take out even like the word women in things, right? There was a scrub of, I believe a NASA program or something, right? Taking out women, the name. And then you're hearing, right, different companies either double down on their DEI initiatives and some withdrawing from it, right? So we're kind of seeing this trickle down effect. And I know in conversations, right, you and I both have spoken about sometimes the way DEI has taken on a life of its own
Yes.
and created some level of confusion. And I know
Yes.
you have spent a lot of time working with different boards and corporations and really expanding their thinking about that. So
Yes.
can you tell us a little bit about like what do you tell boards when it comes to the idea of diversity?
When you think about DEI and diversity, um, and you think about how much traction it got over the years of 2020 through 2023, it took off like crazy. And a lot of the reason why is because people were looking at DEI from a moral imperative. And that was morally it makes sense to surround yourself with stakeholders that people that look like and represent the stakeholders you were doing business with. But unfortunately, we got away from talking to business people about the business case of DEI. And, McKinsey and many others have put out studies about how having a diversified board, a diversified C-suite actually increases your production in many different areas. And that has gotten lost because there was so much focus around the moral imperative. Someone sent me something, and that's what I was looking up as you were talking. Sent me something yesterday or 2 days ago that really made me think. And I don't know who the author of this was, but if you don't mind, I want to take a quick moment and read it. And it's really about what's going on in today's world and political climate. And it says, if you oppose DEI, you should have to use the full phrase instead of the letters. Be brave and say, I oppose diversity, equity, and inclusion. Bonus points if you admit which part of that you don't like. Making it an acronym transforms it into a thought terminating cliche. From now on, be proud of your opinions, but be specific. Let everyone know if it's diversity you don't like, or if it's equity, or if it's being inclusive. I love that. I love that. and
Me too. Thank you for sharing that. And now I feel like I should have said diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I get it though, but it's so easy to, maybe say this term, whether it's ESG, whether it's DEI, is a bad term because we can think about certain situations where it was done incorrectly. And I just had a conversation with a colleague about this, and they used the whataboutisms. What about this and what about that? And I would say, unfortunately, when we're dealing with DEI and or diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're dealing with human beings. And as human beings, sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. And so there are these whataboutisms that are really out there, and we got it wrong. There are situations that happen that may have happened because a woman was in charge or a person of color was in charge, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't qualified. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were a bad hire. They may have made a mistake, or they may have been a bad hire. But to make that correlation to it's because of the organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and plight, that's wrong. And so what's going on in today's society, in today's political climate, is that we're saying that meritocracy and diversity can't coexist, that we need to move away from DEI and move towards merit. But when you really begin to peel the onion back regarding the DEI efforts when they're ran correctly, isn't so much about just recruiting that person that looks different. It's about surrounding yourselves with many different people from many different walks of life that bring a different perspective to the table. But first and foremost, they have to be qualified. So yes, you do fish in a different pond, but in that pond, you expect them to check every single box that you've always expected, of all the boxes that you expected in the past. but now you're just going to different ponds to find these extremely well qualified people. And a lot of research shows that oftentimes women and people of color overeducate themselves just to differentiate themselves to get a shot at a role. So many times these individuals under some DEI programs are even more qualified than the people in the positions today. But what's going on today, for some reason, it feels like with the way we're trying to truncate it, we are confusing the confused and with sound bites and with whataboutisms. And that's a problem. It's always been about merit and finding the best talent, but just fishing in different ponds to find that best talent.
Yeah, I really appreciate you say that because as you were talking about not just checking all the boxes, I was thinking about the fact that it's also not also also often shown that women and people of color not only overeducate themselves for positions, but often won't apply
Yes,
unless they're very qualified and can check all the boxes.
yes.
So it's,
And
you know,
there
it's
are studies, men regarding, regardless of their ethnicity, will raise their hand and say, I can do that job when they only have 25%, meet 25% of the prerequisites. And a woman, regardless of ethnicity, will say, you know what, once I get to 90 or 100% of those prerequisites, I'm going to apply for that job. And it just is what it is. Another thing that I've uncovered during this period of time, and I've seen it, and I don't know if people have malice in this direction, but it felt like at times there was a bit of a hate white man campaign going on out there. I would go to various, read various things or go to an event where they're saying, we can't let a white man go into that role. And that doesn't make sense. No, you hire the best talent out there. You just fish in many different ponds to find them and then let the talent rise and may the best man or woman get that role. Um, and I have even had some white male colleagues of mine say, Keith, what do you think about everything that's going on out there? Is it fair? And yes, if white men represent 30% of the US population and they had 82% of the board seats, and then it eventually went down to 62%, yes, it had to go down to make room for others to get in there unless the board was increasing the number of seats. Moving from 82% to 62% when you represent 30% isn't alarming, but we shouldn't do it in a way that feels like discrimination. I don't support discrimination by any means on anyone. Um, but it seemed like at times it felt like we were beating up white men as if they really maliciously went out there to only hire men. And like I said before, in most cases, they were just hiring people they knew. And I know this man, or they were hiring CEOs, former active CEOs, and I'd only know men in those roles. It was, some of the things that were being said. But once we start changing the nomenclature and broadening the horizon, it afforded the opportunity for more women and people of color to be brought into the role. And they add a tremendous amount of value. So I think if we begin to really focus on what we're trying to do, increase shareholder value and bring more diversity of thought in the room, as well as make certain that your people in the room represent the stakeholders you are trying to serve. And that's how you mitigate your risk while also improving your opportunities for growth. If we focused on that and less on the acronym and less on the words, and then think about those words and say, do I have any issues with diversity? Do I have any issues with equity? Do I have any issues with inclusion? I think we can begin to head in the right direction again and just get away from some of those flashpoints that are out there today, or some of the gaslighting that might not be accurate.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, Keith. One thing though that sits with me, and then I'm going to transition more specifically into the book, though, is that I don't know that there always wasn't some level of malice or misunderstanding from a white man perspective of why it's important to create opportunity and why it's important that there might be some bias happening here, right? Whether it's malicious or not, I don't know that there was enough examination and sometimes without a push. I do believe there are different organizations and corporations and stuff out there that did on their own examine and look around and name the fact like, hey, we need to do something about this because to your point, we're not really representing the population here. This is not the way we should operate, right? As a business, if we're meeting the needs of clients from various backgrounds, then we need to ensure that we have perspective from those backgrounds. And so I think, that's I just wanted to name that before we move into, and I think this is a good transition to your book, actually.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
I appreciate that, Stacey. And if I can add, yes, there are people who do bad things, have bad intent, but the majority of it was just came from that mentality. If it's not broken, why break it, sort of thing. And it's not a problem until someone says it's a problem. And I remember reading a book many years ago, if it's not broke, actually break it. That's how we grow. That's how we disrupt ourselves and so on and so forth. And it's been proven that having that diversity, whether it's observable or cognitive on the board, adds value. Um, we just need to be intentional about it. And that's what it was lacking before was intentionality.
mhm.
So yeah.
Well, how does your book help
Oh,
provide
yeah.
some intentionality to, the boardroom journey,
Yeah.
um, practical guidance for women to secure a seat at the table?
Something I uncovered in research was too many people who weren't getting on boards, they were incredible executives. And most executives believe the prerequisite to getting on the board is just to be an incredible executive and I should get a board seat. Well, being an exceptional executive is just table stakes when it comes to getting on the board. You have to take it a step further. And too many executives wait until 2 to 3 months before their retirement, or 6 months when they're dealing with a bit of imposter syndrome after retirement or boredom after retirement, before they actually state that I want to serve on a corporate board. And it's almost too late then. And really researching hundreds of women executives who successfully got on a private or a public board, many of them were able to look back in their career at a time period when they began to make slightly different tweaks here and there in their corporate journey to be most attractive to a board down the road. And that's what I focus on with the book. I actually picked 4 women, fictitious women that are based off of hundreds of women at certain periods of their board journey career. And so I created a 25-year-old brand new manager in a corporation, a 40-year-old senior manager in a corporation, a 55-year-old executive who says she's going to retire in the next 3 to 5 years, and a 62-year-old CEO of a second generation family business who is now going to turn the business over to her much younger brother. And all 4 women at those stages 25, 40, 55, and 62 said that I'm going to want to serve on a private or a public corporate board. Well, what should they be doing as a brand new manager to orchestrate a career that so that they can get the human capital that they need from an expertise standpoint that will be attractive to boards, while also building their social capital along the way, of the right people to know and have them know them. And so, or to be known by them. And so when you look at what they should be doing at 25, 40, 55, and at 62, the 62-year-old CEO of the family business has been a CEO for 12 years. She's been an executive director on her own board as a CEO, but she's never been an independent director. So, what should she be thinking about to not only take her board experience from her own company's board and move into an independent or a non-executive director sort of mentality? And so, what I talk about throughout the book is one, being intentional about the steps you should make, and then two, getting executives to take off their unconsciously competent executive hat and intentionally put on their consciously competent governance hat. Because going in for a interview with your unconsciously competent executive hat on will only get you another C-suite position. It will not get you a board role. And so teaching people how to shift, that's one of the steps and one of the things that I talk often, within the book about.
Oh boy, now I'm like, shall we go with the Alice in Wonderland or the advice? But I'm going to stick with Alice
Yeah.
in Wonderland because you're talking so much about intention.
Mhm.
And you chose a quote from Alice in Wonderland that, I just delighted me when I read it, which is when Alice comes, to the treasure cat and Alice says, "Would you please tell me which way I ought to go from here?" And the treasure cat says, "Well, that depends on where you want to go." Right?
Yeah.
And she says, "Well, I don't really care." And then he says, "Well, then it doesn't matter which way you go." And he's like, "Well, I just, want to get somewhere," says Allison. She says, "Oh, well, you sure can do that if you walk long enough, right?" And so I'm not saying it verbatim, but the
Yeah,
idea is
that's it.
there, right?
That's
And
it. And the title of that chapter that it was Select a Destination. And knowing what I wanted to write about from a board perspective, I was reminded by that part of Alice in Wonderland because that's what a lot of executives do. Many of them would tell me as a search professional, they would come to me and say, Keith, I want you to help me get on a corporate board. And I would like you to find a great board for me and so that I can serve. And what type of board do you want? And the response oftentimes was, Keith, I don't care. I just want to get on a paid board. And that reminded me of Cheshire Cat. But the problem there is what Cheshire was talking about, you'll end up wherever you want. When you have that mentality with a board without really narrowing your destination and what is really where you're going to bring value, you're just going to wander around aimlessly and never end up on a corporate board. And so there are a couple schools of thought. One school of thought is don't narrow your path. You have such incredible human capital and vast experience as a business person over the past 30 or 40 years. Just let people know you want to get on a board, and that should do it. And when you're working with the search professional, that we have thousands of people that we have interacted with, how am I to think of you when something comes up if you don't help narrow it down for me? And so I spend a lot of time asking people to reflect. Reflect on your why, reflect on what brings you joy, reflect on where you were successful and why. What's your secret sauce? What are your superpowers? And when you begin to uncover those things, then when you do pick the area and the type of board and the maturity of the company and different things where you know you can add value, remember I said it's table stakes for the people you're interviewing against to be exceptional executives. The difference is the way you show up, the way you light up in that interview because you are in your zone, asking the right questions, talking about the things that bring you joy and are germane to their situation. You're asking the right questions, but the energy, because it's something that you're passionate about, is what it comes down to. That's the differentiator. You're both the two people that have the exact same resume or a similar resume will show up differently when you're dealing with something that brings you one person, it brings them joy, and the other person's just looking for paid a paid board role. But you both have incredible talent. It's that person that's passionate is the one that gets tapped. And that's what this that section and that chapter is about. And Alice in Wonderland, I thought was just a fun way. One, because you've been reading heady stuff that makes you think. It brings you back down so that you can begin to think again and tie it together, connect the dots.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I thought it was a really awesome intro to that, but also just in general of, you know, how you want to just keep on walking. You can get anywhere you want. You can get somewhere, but where do
Yeah,
you want to get? What, and as you're saying, what brings you that joy and passion? And that really also communicates to people across from you and they get excited about wanting to work with you and bring you into the board. I imagine. I don't have
absolutely.
much experience with board.
I'll give you another example also, Stacey. I remember writing an article for Forbes, and I talked about really analyzing yourself and what brings you joy and so on and so forth. And so you can uncover where you're going to be able to bring the most and add the most value. There was a board member that I know who she served on three Fortune 500 public boards. And she called me up and said, Keith, do you have time to talk with me this afternoon? I got to share something with you. And I said, yeah, sure. And so 3 hours later, we hopped on a Zoom and we had a quick conversation. She said, Keith, you posted your article from Forbes out this morning. I read it immediately and I started to cry because you helped me bring clarity to something that's been weighing heavy on my mind. She said one of my three Fortune 500 boards just has not been bringing me joy. And my term is coming up in the next 13 months. And because of your article and having me reflect, I have decided today that I am not going to uh, go for a second term with this board because I'm not the right fit. Can I do the job because of my human capital? Absolutely. I ask the right questions, things like that. But it doesn't bring me joy. And I am taking up space, she said, for someone who would bring so much more to this board because it was in their sweet spot. And she said, I'm not going to do that. This board deserves better, and I deserve better. And thank you. And she cried again. And I cried on as well. I said, thank you, because that brings me joy. That's why I'm writing it.
Yeah.
So that more people can reflect and get to where you are, hopefully before they join the board, versus,
Hmm.
but better late than never. And that I think we got to take the time to do that because just getting on a paid board isn't what it's all about. Life's too short.
I feel like that's advice. I love that. Getting on a paid board is not what it's all about. Life is too short. But if we could do just like super briefly, I'm gonna call out actually you named the ages of the people that you followed. So I'm gonna say the age 25, 40, 55, and 62. And if you could briefly thinking about even more generalizing someone early in their career, kind of mid-career towards the end.
Yeah.
Right. What advice would you give them if they wanted to get on a board? So, like the quickest advice you could give, like a 20, 30-second advice. So, 25-year-old.
25-year-old, join a nonprofit board that has fiduciary responsibilities. There are not-for-profit boards and there are nonprofit boards. A not-for-profit board will want you to come on so that you can help them raise money. You won't get a lot of transferable skills from a not-for-profit board, but they are. But if you're passionate about what they're doing, join because you're doing something that brings you joy. But a nonprofit board the only difference between a nonprofit board and a profit board is the word non. They're ran basically the same. They have fiduciary responsibilities. You will get a tremendous amount of transferable skills that you could take to a private or a public board later. And the people sitting around the board table with you at the nonprofit board often are serving on private and public corporate boards, and they get to see you in action. And one day they're going to tap you on the shoulder when they're sitting around the board table. Who do you know? I know Mary. We serve on a nonprofit board together. So that's what I would recommend for the 25-year-old.
Awesome. All right. How about the 40-year-old?
40-year-old, look at her career, his or her career, and where they are right now. Where do they ultimately want to go if they, and do they truly want to serve on a corporate board? And then analyze what skill sets you have today and where do you have gaps? And think about your next promotion and getting a promotion where you can begin to fill some of those gaps that are going to be attracted to a board later on.
Okay. 55-year-old.
55-year-old, you're pretty much there and you're almost ready to retire. In that example, what can you do to get more experience in your executive role today with your existing board that you have at your company? Can you present to them more? Can you observe them more? Because a lot of people think the way you get board experience is by serving on a board, but interacting with the board will also give you experience that we in the search profession will say that's transferable. So really look at what can you do internally with your own board and begin and join the board related organizations so that you can begin to improve your social capital and more people can learn what you're doing and where you would like to go.
I just want to point out that that little advice reminds me a lot of what we've heard from different members that have come on to talk about school boards. So
Mhm.
just to make that, go be at the meetings, right? And learn what it's about. And so that's great. And then lastly, our 62-year-old.
I would say the 62-year-old makes certain one that he or she doesn't tell themselves I'm too old. And to really take stock at all the experience you have developed over the years. In this example, this person has served on her own company board as an executive director for 12 years. That's a tremendous amount of experience. But at the same time, join a board related organization so you can learn how to take that experience and be an independent or a non-executive director. And I will also say, make certain that you let anyone and everyone know that you are interested in serving as an independent director on a X type of board, and these are the reasons why. And so I tell people to add another 7 to 11 seconds to their autopilot introduction of themselves. So if they're typically taking 23 seconds at a dinner party to say what they do for a living or who they are, add another 7 or 11 more seconds and say, and I serve on my corporate board, one nonprofit board, and I am seeking a private company board in this industry. Because most people find their boards by sharing that they want to get on the board. 67 to 75% of the board seats are found via your network. Only
Mhm.
a small percent come from recruiters. So by letting anyone and everyone know that you're interested in the board, people will be talking about you without your knowledge. And that's how many people end up finding boards.
Awesome. And that piece of advice seems like anyone can take.
And
I love that. Just being really, again, coming back to intentional, really weave throughout this time together today and being clear and sharing that forward really shined through about the opportunities on a board for ourselves, etc. Keith, thank you so much for being with us today. Where can people follow you, read about your articles, etc.?
You can find many of my articles in the feature section of my LinkedIn profile. I also have a website that's being launched next week, as a matter of fact, and that's called boardroomjourney.com. And you can find my articles. You can find various things about the new book that's coming out. And so either on boardroomjourney.com or Keith D. Dorsey LinkedIn profile, you can find most of everything that I'm focused on out there.
Amazing, amazing. And you can also pre-order your book on Amazon. Is there other places people can pre-order the book?
Great question, and thank you, Stacey. You could pre-order on Barnes and Noble, Amazon are the two big ones out there. There are others, and if you go to my website, boardroomjourney.com, and click the one area called the book, you can see many of the reviews that I've had and the various places you can actually order the book today. It's scheduled for release on May the 6th, but we're definitely taking your orders right now.
Amazing. Awesome. And thank you, listeners, of course, for listening to another episode of Educate US. We are a proud member of Leon Media Network. Make sure to download us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you've been listening via Apple Podcasts, be sure to leave us 5 stars. It really helps us out. And as always, we're willing and want to have conversations if you're listening to the show. So send us an email, theeducateusshow@gmail.com. Thanks, everybody.